We are going to be looking at a lot of Scripture. We didn't look at that much Scripture last time with Pontius Pilate. We're looking at 3 points about him, the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. First of all, we looked at our knowledge concerning him, the sources for that knowledge. Things like the New Testament, chiefly the New Testament, and Josephus, and Philo, and Tacitus, and the Caesarean inscription. Then we looked some at his pre-passion history. And thirdly, tonight, we'll spend all of our time this evening on this topic. Chiefly, Pilate enters history in his relation to the death of Jesus Christ. That's where he's best known, in Christ's passion. That's where we know him, remember, from the Apostles' Creed, suffered under Pontius Pilate. Now, I'm not going to even attempt to be exhaustive in this. Well, it's a very detailed area, all of the aspects, especially when you try to get everything in order. The aspects of the order of Christ's various trials through which he went. You see, he went through more than one at different periods of a 24-hour clock. And to try to reconcile all of that, it's not impossible, but it's rather difficult in the Gospel. So we're not going to be exhaustive, but we are going to share a few things with you, beginning with John chapter 18. Primarily, we'll be in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and of course, toward the end of each of those 4, looking at the passion narratives. Just to give ourselves a little better picture of Pontius Pilate. Intertestamental period, remembers what we're in, and we're looking at the political backgrounds to the period between the Testaments, and now we've gone so far in politics that we're up to the political backgrounds to the first half of the New Testament. Now, the Romans attempted, I think I've said this before, to give as much governing authority as possible to the local people in an imperial province. They tried to leave them with their customs, with their politics, most importantly with their religion intact. One thing that the Romans did not do was introduce their religion. You remember how various nations of the Old Testament did that to Israel. Whenever they came into Israel's territory or brought Israel into theirs, the first thing they tried to do was to introduce their gods into Israel's life. And that's, of course, one of the primary reasons why Israel was to be nationally so opposed to the various nations surrounding her, because of this subject of idolatry. That's not so true. It's not that there wasn't a Roman pantheon. There certainly was, and we'll be to that later, which is based upon the Greek pantheon. We'll be to that later whenever we look at some of the religious and spiritual backgrounds to the period between the Testaments. But I suppose that's an interesting point to begin with, and I suppose that's something worth taking note of, a difference between the Romans. We find out throughout the New Testament the apostolic leaders are always saying, submit to the Romans, submit to the government, submit to your authority, submit to the leaders. You hardly find that so pronounced in the Old Testament because of the problem of idolatry, because of the problem of the introduction of foreign gods. Rome doesn't try to do that. Rome is intelligent enough and cultural enough and civilized enough, and she has been around long enough to realize the way you subdue a people basically is through non-subduction. You take over, in the technical sense, those people and their territory. You levy your taxes and so forth upon them, but you leave the people in their heritage intact, their culture, their way of doing things, their beliefs, which would involve their gods. The same was true as far as the Romans were concerned with the politics. They tried to leave as much governing authority as possible in the hands of the local people. The Sanhedrin had arisen in the period between the Testaments. This is when it came to such great importance. And of course, that's not done away with at all by the Romans. It's encouraged, as a matter of fact, by the Romans, because that would leave the Romans free from so many of these petty spiritual religious questions that could be dealt with in the Sanhedrin. Questions, by the way, that the Romans would really not be prepared to deal with or answer, because they don't know about the gods and the mysteries and all of the ins and outs of the Jews' religion. In John 18, verses 31 and 32, however, we do have one exception. as far as the Romans leaving as much governing authority and power in the hands of the local people. And that concerns capital cases. Now, I mentioned before that the Sanhedrin, especially the Great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, had the right to try many different cases. Most of them were of a religious nature. We could almost say all of them, because even those that had... Israel was a religious community. Even her politics were religio-political politics and not just politics alone. So just about any question in Israel's ancient history, although it might have dealt with something civil or something political, also dealt with something religious and something spiritual as well. Because of their worldview and because of their view of God. They saw God as interacting. Think of all the laws, how he came right down to what you could eat and couldn't eat and how to build your home and what to wear and how to plant your crops. God came right down and involved himself in almost every single aspect of Jewish society. So everything for them was a religious question, basically, if you want to go behind the scenes, and therefore basically could be dealt with by the Sanhedrin. The whole question of Jesus and his guilt versus his innocence, as far as the religious leaders are concerned, revolves around the charge of blasphemy. So we know, again, we're talking about a spiritual case, a spiritual charge. And I've said before that although all of this that I've said thus far is true, the Romans nevertheless kept for themselves the right of capital cases and capital punishment. We know that not only from extra-biblical sources, but from these verses, John 18, verses 28 through 32. We're going to look at these more later. So we'll just take verse 31. This is a very, very important verse. Verse 32 kind of is a fulfillment of some things said earlier, and it even goes on to say that verse 31 is a fulfillment, which makes 32 the fulfillment of that. But we're just going to be concerned with this 31st verse. Then said Pilate unto them, the Jewish people, who had brought Jesus to him, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. Now, this is the governing authority of the whole province now, Pontius Pilate, saying, you have the right of judicial government yourself. You take this man and judge him according to your law. And here's the Jews' response. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. Now that alerts Pilate right away to the fact that they and he are not dealing with some insignificant question here. They haven't said really much of what's going on, but it's a capital case as far as the Jews are concerned. We'll find out here in a moment, not as far as Pontius Pilate is concerned. It's no capital case at all. But his laws are different than the Jewish laws. The Jewish laws said blasphemy was a capital case. And in the perverted misunderstanding of Jesus' earthly ministry by the religious leaders, they felt it to be just that, a case of blasphemy. The Jews said therefore to him, It's not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Because one thing the Jews never practiced was crucifixion. And yet if you remember earlier here in this gospel in John chapter 12, he said, If I be lifted up, then I'll draw all men unto me. And it even said there, this he said, thus signifying by what death he would glorify God. The lifting up was just a common way of expressing crucifixion. So it's interesting to see how all of this works itself out. The Jews under the Old Covenant, whenever they were prior to Roman times of intervention, they would never have said what they say here in verse 31. It's not lawful for us to put any man to death. Because according to the law of Moses, it was most lawful for them to put someone to death. Well, they're not talking about Mosaic law here. They're talking about the law that now governs the land, and that's Roman law. But it's interesting to see how they go back and forth, depending on what the circumstances are, whether they want to beg for the Mosaic law being instituted or used or enforced here, or go to the Roman side. In other words, the Jews of all people hate Roman intervention in their land. That's easy to see in the New Testament. And why is it now, so piously they say, now it would be against the law for us to put any man to death? Why don't they just go ahead and execute him? Well, they know of all the trouble that they can get into as a result of that. And so as the circumstances are convenient for them, they play like we are true, honest, law-abiding subjects of the Roman Empire. It's not lawful for us to put any man to death. It's interesting to see how God has worked through all of this to work all of this out, to take away from the Jews a privilege and a prerogative that they did have under the older covenant, simply because whenever Christianity comes along and comes on the scene, everything is so misunderstood they could be putting everyone to death. And of course they do put a few people to death. But this is reserved for the Roman government, so it won't be like a lynch mobbing, but it will be an official Roman act that is legal and lawful, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. And they even give you a cross-reference back into chapter 12. Okay, let's kind of start looking at the trials, plural, of Christ. Again, we're not going to be exhaustive in this area. We're just going to give you enough information to see Pilate in these affairs. See if we can kind of, as I go along, work all of this out together in our minds. We have to stay here in John's Gospel because he gives us the most complete ending to Jesus' earthly life, that is prior to crucifixion. Okay, first of all, we have to start out with the last night that Jesus and the disciples spend together. For this, we go all the way back to chapter 13. And then basically, just in order, John works his way through those last hours of Jesus' life. I mean, it's less than a day, less than a 24-hour period between what we have here in chapter 13 and what we're going to end up with, the crucifixion, over in chapter 19. Now, there's 7 long chapters from 13 to 19, but less than 24 hours take place during this period of time because he's packed so much information into this. Okay, we've got their meal together. Sometime during the meal, we have the foot washing. Evidently, Judas is present. Judas Iscariot is present during all of this. Verse 11, he knew who should betray him, therefore said he, ye are not all clean. He goes on in verse 21 to the prediction of his betrayal. Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. We're never told who this is, but another interesting facet of John's Gospel is that John, the apostle, is never mentioned in this Gospel, never mentioned by name. Now John Baptist is, but John the apostle is never mentioned, although he's mentioned in the other 3 Gospels. James and John always occur. You find them mentioned like that, James and John. You don't find John ever mentioned in his Gospel, probably because he is the author of this Gospel. That's one way of reasoning back to, well, who is the author of this? Whose name is conspicuously absent. And absent for what reasons? Probably modesty. And so he doesn't name himself, but perhaps he is, and probably more than perhaps, he is this man in verse 23. There was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loves. He goes on to talk about Peter and Judas Iscariot and all the rest of them, but he never mentions himself, probably because of modesty. Now we could draw a whole diagram of what it would have looked like, the Last Supper. It does not look like most paintings where they're all seated at a table, all on the same side of the table, where you really can't converse with anyone. They're not seated, they're lying down on the floor. So they're wrong to begin with in having a table like that. But anyway, you get some interesting points out of this. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, saith unto him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus said to him, That thou doest, do quickly. well, we don't want to get too far off the subject. We're talking about Pilate, not Judas Iscariot, but some people have said that probably Judas Iscariot was one of the ones right on Jesus' left or right hand. He was a treasurer, so he probably held a place of prominence in their midst. Peter probably could have even spoken through him to get to John the Apostle, who was on the other side of Jesus, verse 23. He was the one leaning on Jesus' bosom. And furthermore, with Jesus saying, I'm going to predict, I'm going to show who it is that's going to do this evil deed by giving him the sop, verse 26, then he gives it to Judas, verse 26, and then he tells him, that thou doest, do quickly. And then they're still concerned who the final betrayer will be, which might point to the fact that what took place between Jesus and Judas Iscariot went unnoticed by everyone else. Maybe they didn't hear what he said because Judas was so close by him. Anyway, we get over into chapters 14. Well, before I go on, I have to just say just chapter 14. Some of this teaching, particularly about the Holy Spirit in John 14. Then we have a little break or a little pause in the narrative, the last phrase in chapter 14, and then chapters 15 and 16 pick up with more teaching on love, more teaching on discipleship, and chiefly more teaching on the Holy Spirit. Then in John chapter 17, we finally have his prayer. By the time we open chapter 18, we already find him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, John, unlike the synoptic writers, does not go through this process of Jesus going and praying, if it be thy will, Father, remove the cup, nevertheless, not what I will, but thine be done. Notice that's not here in John's Gospel. That's over in the other Gospels, but not here in John's Gospel. Kind of all of that is just passed over in these first few verses as maybe being understood to have taken place. Like in verse 2, Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted thither with his disciples. And we know he resorted thither with his disciples and took a few of them a little further along with him. So we have the arresting band. Judas then, having received this band or cohort of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. They go through this little episode, and then it's not until verse 13 that we finally enter our first aspect of his trial. The cohort and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him, and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Okay, it's after dark. We know that. They would have had a late meal there together, and notice all that takes place, and John doesn't intend for us to understand that this is all that Jesus said. John 14, 15, 16, then the prayer in chapter 17. Remember, they're interrupting him, particularly in the early portions of chapter 14, time and time again, saying, Now give us some more understanding. I'm going somewhere, and whither I go, ye shall not go now, but ye shall go later, and the way ye know. And Thomas says, well, wait a minute, where are you going? What are you talking about? And then Judas says, well, show us the Father. And then they're always interrupting, asking him questions. That could have gone on for a long time. We also know it's night because, remember, Peter's going to be warming himself by the charcoal later on here on this very same evening. We don't know what time it is, but it's way past dark. It's into the night. They lead him away to Annas, who probably is all prepared because they are the ones, Annas and Caiaphas, who have actually sent out these men to find Jesus. He was a father-in-law to Caiaphas, so forth. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And here's this anonymity again. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and we kind of wish he was known unto us too, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without, and we go through this episode. Then the high priest asked Jesus, verse 19, of his disciples and of his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spake openly in the world. I ever taught in the synagogue, in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. And so why are you questioning me now privately about this? When he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck him with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus said, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Okay, then into the second aspect, verse 24, he's led from Annas next to Caiaphas, the son-in-law to Annas and the current high priest. By now we're past midnight, so we're between 1 and 6 in the morning. You see, Jesus got no sleep this night, neither did the religious leaders, neither did a lot of the Jews standing around, neither did Jesus' disciples. They're going through quite an episode here. You know, just hearing teaching, if it's, good teaching from God's Word, especially the spiritual teaching of John chapters 14 through 16, can really be taxing on a person mentally. You just absorb so much material there, listening to what all Jesus had to say. Now going through all the trauma of the various stages of his trial. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. I'm in verse 25. They said therefore unto him, Art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the slaves of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? And Peter then denied again. And immediately the cock crew. The cock was only crowing between several different times, but between midnight and 6 a.m. Okay, now, before we get into verse 28, let's jump back into the synoptics. I'll have to find the passages. They're probably easy to find, though. Matthew 26, verse 57, through verse 75. Probably very few of you would even know how all of this fits together like this. Is why we're kind of taking the time to do this right now. First, it would have been a short meeting with Annas, and then probably a longer meeting with Caiaphas. Verse 57. And by the way, John's Gospel is the only one that gives us the meeting with Annas. Neither in Mark, Matthew, or Luke do we have this meeting with Annas. We only have the meeting with Caiaphas. So John 18, verses 13 through 24 is unique in that regard. Because you see in verse 56 of Matthew 26, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. This is at his arrest. And the next statement, and they that had him laid hold on Jesus and led him away to Caiaphas. Without John, we would think those things took place immediately after verse 56, that he went immediately from his arrest right to Caiaphas. But we first of all have this John 18, 13 to 24 interlude of a pre-trial, as it were, before Annas, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Now they had to have gone from Annas' place now to that of Caiaphas. But Peter followed him afar off into the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. They try to bring false witnesses. None of the witnesses really agree. Verse 63, Jesus holds his peace. Finally, the high priest, is really irritated that he cannot get anything against Jesus. And he cries out, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. He's at wit's end here to get some type of evidence against him. And here's his evidence. And Jesus gave the evidence willingly. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said. That's just another way of saying what you've said is right. It always comes across a little strange and unusual in an English version like this, but he doesn't just mean, well, you said that, but it's not necessarily true. When he says, Thou hast said, he means thou hast said right. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. You see, remember, Jesus said that no one could take his life. He would lay it down and he would take it up again. And that's not only to be thought of as a reference to crucifixion, but to his whole condemnation in the trial. They had no evidence against him. That no two witnesses could agree about him. They had no evidence at all. And finally, at wit's end, the high priest cries out what he does in verse 63, And Jesus could have done like he did in the beginning of verse 63. Jesus held his peace. He could have said, "Art thou the Son of God?" And Jesus didn't have to give him an answer. He said, "I lay my life down and I take it up again." And he knew that in saying what he did, in confessing, "Yes, I am God," that's blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and he would bring about his own death then. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses?" Because they don't have any witnesses that will agree together. "Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye?" He's speaking now, verse 57b, to the scribes and the elders that were assembled. "What think ye?" They answered and said, "He's guilty of death." Well, that's true, according to Mosaic law. If it's blasphemy, he's guilty of death. Then they go through their mockery of him, and then we go back to Peter for verses 69 through 75. All right, let's look in Mark's Gospel and find where this is. Chapter 14, verses 53 through 72. Mark 14, 53 through 72. It's going to read very similar to Matthew, inasmuch as it appears that Jesus' trial before Caiaphas followed immediately upon the heels of his arrest in Gethsemane. They led Jesus away to the high priest, first of all to Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest, and then to Caiaphas. And with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. An added group of people now, according to Mark, from what we found in Matthew. Peter followed far off, so forth. Verse 59, witnesses didn't agree. And again we see this, verse 61, the high priest said, "Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Exasperated, that's about his last option. And Jesus said, "I am. Ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And the high priest rent his clothes and saith, "What need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye?" They all condemned him to be guilty of death. They go through the mockery. Then again, verses 66 through 72 is Peter's episode. Then over into Luke in chapter 22, verses 54 through 71. You see, most of the episodes here, most of the episodes in each of these Gospels, we're not to Pilate's yet. We're just speaking of Annas and Caiaphas. Most of these deal in quite some length with the trial before Caiaphas. Then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed far off. And I don't think we need to go through all that again, except to get to the end, verse 67, "Art thou the Christ? Tell us." He said, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I also ask you, you will not answer me. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Art thou the Son of God?" So we're given more information here in Luke than in Matthew and Mark. And he said unto them, "Ye say that I am." They said, What need we any further witnesses? We ourselves have heard his own mouth." Okay, so he's from Annas to Caiaphas. By the time Caiaphas is through with him, it's a very, very early morning hour, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. And each of the Gospels will tell us that immediately he was then taken to the residence of Pontius Pilate. And here's why. According to records of the daily activity of Roman leaders, they were always up by 5 in the morning, and they were generally through with their daily routine and duties by 12 noon. Therefore, the religious leaders knew they had to get to Pilate as soon as he woke up in the morning. You see, few people know this, know all of these details here. Now, you're not in much of a mood to do anything or think anything or say anything as soon as you wake up in the morning. So they catch him at really an opportune time here as far as they're concerned. But they know if they don't catch him, he doesn't just open up his palace to anyone who wants to talk to him, to anyone who's got a case. He's going to be busy that day. He's got things that he has to accomplish. Therefore, if they arrive around 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, he's going to say, I'm busy, I've got other things to do. But if you can be the first one in line there, catch him first thing in the morning, the odds are he might give you an audience before him. They're kind of hoping this is what's going to take place. And that's exactly what does take place. So let's start back in Matthew again and find the references into Pontius Pilate. Okay, we finished out chapter 26. He's through with Caiaphas. Notice the first verse in Matthew 27. When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. Okay, really what we have here now, before we even get to Pilate, is our third aspect of the trial. First before Annas, then before Caiaphas, then a morning session before all of the leaders, and then in the fourth place, he'll go before Pilate. And he has more than one episode before Pilate, because Pilate sends him to Antipas, and then Antipas sends him back. It's questioned by some people whether the various aspects of the trial that took place during hours of darkness are really even legal in Jewish law. But whatever the case may be there, assuming for the moment that they were not legal, then what makes it legal is they do meet early in the morning, so it's not in a darkness hour. When the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. That's another council now, another trial, entirely different than Annas and Caiaphas. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So here we're on number 4 for the aspects of his trial, and finally he is before Pontius Pilate. So there's Matthew 27:2. Then over in Mark, we finished out chapter 14. It'll introduce us into 15. Chapter 15 and verse 1. Mark 15:1. Am I going too quickly for you to write and read? No. Mark 15:1. And straightway in the morning the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. Mark 15:1. Then in Luke, we finished out chapter 22. That would leave us with Luke 23:1. Luke 23:1. The whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. We don't have the morning given as in Matthew and Mark. Would appear to have taken place all at the same time. It does come right after that, but they state it to be morning and not night. Whereas we know it's night before because Peter's out there warming himself by the fire. The whole multitude of them arose and they led him to Pilate. And then in John does give us the Pilate. He gives us all of these, the Annas, the Caiaphas, and he gives us the Pilate. John chapter 18. So we're back in that passage where we looked before, John 18:31, but we really need to begin with verse 28. We're not given so clearly here in John this third step of the morning consultation. We go from Annas, because he gives us Annas. The others don't give us that. So we can supply what he doesn't give from the other three. Then he gives us secondly Caiaphas. Peter then denied again, verse 27, and immediately the cock crew. Then verse 28 kind of skips over the morning consultation, and they're heading toward the Roman leader. Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves, he tells us that it's early, but it's not the same thing as the Jewish consultation. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall. Remember Herod had a judgment hall in Caesarea? Well, remember Herod also has a fortress as well as, the fortress of Antonia as well as his palace here in Jerusalem. And Pontius Pilate has to be taking up temporary residence in one or the other of those two, either in Antonia or the formerly personal residence and palace of Herod the Great in Jerusalem. They themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, the Jewish people, going into Roman quarters, that is, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, what type of problem do we have right there? You're shaking your head. You don't know, or you do know? What type of problem do we have right there? That last phrase. They just ate the Passover, or did they? Or was it a pre-Paschal meal that they ate? I thought what we had back here earlier in John chapter 13 with the foot washing and so forth was the Passover. Isn't that even what's given? Verse 13, chapter 13, verse 1. Now before it says it differently here. Before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, he should depart out of the world unto the Father. Supper being ended, the devil having put into the heart of Judas and so forth. Well, so John at least is consistent with himself between chapters 13 and 18, although some people would question his consistency with the synoptic writers. Seems like that they are still anticipating in the future, the Jewish leaders in John 18:28, the Passover. They don't want to be defiled by going into a Roman residence. They want to be able to eat the Passover, evidently that evening. You know, you'd eat the Passover between the sunsets, as the Jewish rabbis taught, between whenever the sun set and whenever the sun really set and darkness would come. So they're anticipating the Passover, so that's an involved question. But anyway, they brought him to Pilate early in the morning. We were just told in verse 28. I think some people have the misconception that all this took place, in the afternoon or in the evening, toward the end of Pilate's day or something. But we're told very clearly in verse 28, it was early. Pilate then went out unto them. They would have come before either the doors to Antonia, the fortress, or the doors to his personal palace and residence there, and have requested an audience before him, and the porter would have gone in and reported this to Pilate, and Pilate would either come out or not come out, and he decides to come out. Pilate went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? They have him bound now, brought before Pilate. They answered and said unto him, this is really a smart-alecky remark here. And Pilate gets a little smart-alecky with them as the whole process goes along. You can really see personalities developing here. What accusation? And, they're kind of offended. Well, if there wasn't some legitimate accusation, we never would have brought him to you. And Pilate could have said, you shut up, you fool. I'm not questioning that. I'm wanting to know, what accusation do you have? They didn't even tell him the accusation. They're just saying, well, if there had not been a legitimate one, we never would have wasted our time coming here. If he were not a malefactor, we would have not delivered him up unto thee. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him. This is where Pilate's getting back at them now. Take ye him and judge him according to your law. Pilate saying, you wasted your time, to come over. The Jews therefore said to him, It's not lawful for us to put any man to death. And then we have the saying of verse 32. Now, what they charge Jesus with, they have several charges. Whenever they are amongst themselves, the Jewish leaders, the charge is blasphemy. Whenever they bring him before the Roman leaders, the charge is sedition. They change the charge because they know they stand a better case of winning a decision favorable to them if they have something that the Romans can sink their teeth into. The real charge in their minds is blasphemy. They don't care whether they kind of hope he does overthrow the Roman government. That's what they're looking for, is someone to practice sedition against the Roman government. What are you talking about? This is our charge against this man. You see how false and hypocritical these people are? By pretense playing that we are loyal subjects to the Roman Empire, we found some fella speaking against Caesar, and we brought him unto you. I'm sure they spoke against Caesar all the time, every opportunity they had. And they were just looking for someone to come along and overthrow the Roman government. Remember how many people went out with Judas of Galilee in Acts 5:37, when in the days of the taxing. He's trying to overthrow the Roman government. And that was a popular movement in that day. So this should have been a popular movement, but just that Jesus' teaching was so striking to their consciences that they knew that this man is different. He's not just going to be a political rebel. For this we have to turn back to Luke. studying Luke chapter 23, studying the Passion account is an exercise in finger mobility, because you really do have to go back and forth between all of the gospel narratives. But this is what we're trying to emphasize now. The charge is changed from blasphemy to sedition. Luke 23:2, whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man speaking blasphemy, no, perverting the nation, and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar." Well, he never did do that. He answered their question in a very subtle way, and I guess it was left open for them to misinterpret and misunderstand that, saying that he himself is Christ the King. And in verse 5 as well, Luke 23:2 and 5. They were the more fierce, saying, "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." Now that would not have failed to catch the attention of Pontius Pilate, because it sounds like a popular revolt is on the rise. He stirreth up the people. That would be something that would catch his attention, where blasphemy, he could care less about blasphemy. But someone stirring up the people, news getting back to Caesar that I cannot control my own territory here, therefore he's going to take me out and put another prefect in, his ears would perk up in a hurry over that. You might also want to note John 19:12. We just don't have the time to run all of these references and say everything that could be said, but John 19:12, they talk about, well, any man who's not going to be a friend of Caesar is not our friend, and this Jesus isn't, and therefore you aren't. Because if you're a friend with him, you're not a friend with Caesar. Now what Pilate recognizes, remember Agrippa the First has spoken of him as a harsh, arrogant man. They have been spoken of as sponges. They have been spoken of as the spleen of the empire. But although Pontius Pilate probably was harsh, we've seen that in some of his earlier accounts of how he dealt with Jewish revolts and Jewish uprisings. He is also a man of incredible personality, of an incredible ability to psychoanalyze people, to get behind their statements and read their motives. He's no dummy, in other words. Pontius Pilate is extremely adept at reading people's motives through what they say or through what they do. And what he ascertains almost immediately is that there is a personal problem between the religious leaders and Jesus, not between Jesus and the Roman government. Therefore, their little ploy doesn't seem to work, at least not initially, of the Jewish leaders. To put themselves on the side of Caesar and Jesus on the opposite side, essentially this is what they're doing. Then they ask Pilate, pick which side you're going to be on. Either our sides and Caesar's, or on Jesus' side. And of course he sees through all of that it's really not a case of you putting yourself on one side with the Roman government and Jesus on another side. It's virtually you against Jesus. I don't enter the picture. Caesar doesn't enter the picture. Tribute money doesn't enter the picture. The Roman government doesn't enter the picture. It's you people against this man. He recognizes that almost immediately. For instance, in Matthew chapter 27.
For the continuation of this message, please turn in the